Hey everyone, today I wanted to talk about what a contract for deed is, often called a CFD, you'll hear, what it isn't, some of the risks and some of the benefits of doing contract for deed, both for the buyer and the seller. So, what is contract for deed? It's essentially seller carrying the financing for a buyer. What it's not rent to own, it is not renting, it's very different than those two things. So, what is it in a nutshell? In a nutshell, a seller carries the financing for a buyer who can't or doesn't want to get a loan for various reasons. And so the buyer is making monthly payments to the seller. And at the end of the term of that contract, the home then, a deed is then recorded and the buyer becomes the owner of record. So why do this? Well, there's so many reasons. Buyers can't get financing for many different reasons. Think about maybe someone's run into some trouble with their credit. Maybe they've been through a divorce. Maybe they just never built up any credit at all. Or a lot of times where I've seen it is it's a owner of a small business who maybe is their earnings aren't quite good enough, or they haven't done it long enough, so they can't get a loan. Or they're making a lot of cash, but they've got a lot of expenses. So on paper, they're not making enough to get that loan. So this, by the way, is not for everybody. But just so you know what it is and why you might do it, what are the benefits for a seller? Well, just think supply and demand. Right now, it's a seller's market anyways, but it's even less supply of houses that could go contract for deed. And there's a big demand for contract for deed houses from buyers. So little supply, high demand puts that seller in a really good position. So minimal competition, meaning the buyers don't negotiate much on price. A lot of times they don't get inspections. There's not appraisals. It's usually a quick closing, lower closing costs. There's additional earnings on top of the sales price and interest. You're charging interest on that installment throughout that term of the contract for deed. So there's a lot of reasons that a seller might like it. A seller might not like it if they need that quick payout right away. If they can't wait the 2 to 3 years that they need to wait to get that final payoff. And one of the other benefits is if that buyer decides to walk away partway through the contract, the seller keeps all that equity that they've taken in over the course of the contract. What are some risks for the sellers? Well, you have to wait until the contract is fully fulfilled to get the full payoff amount. So some people just cannot wait that long. Oh yeah, what if a buyer just walks partway through and destroys the house? Certainly that is a risk, and that has happened. In my experience, I've not seen it happen, and this is much different than a rental, because in a rental situation, a tenant might not care for the house as if it's their own, whereas in a contract for deed, the buyer has a lot of equity built into this, and they want to take care of their investment. The other thing is, if say a water heater goes out throughout the course of that contract, the seller is not the landlord. So the seller isn't going to get that call in the middle of the night saying, "Hey, my water heater's out." No, the buyer is actually buying the house. It's just that the seller is carrying the financing. So if there is a mortgage still involved, it stays on your credit report. That's another risk for the seller. If you're wanting to get rid of that mortgage off of your credit report, that doesn't happen until this is closed out. And also if the buyer doesn't keep up with the property, doesn't keep their grass mowed, you could get city ordinances. So there are some risks for the seller. What about from the buyer side? What's the benefits? For the buyer, sometimes it's their only option. So if there is a seller that's willing to do this, that may be their only option to get into an ownership position versus renting. Other benefits is it can be a very quick closing. Sometimes I've had buyers do this just for that simple fact. They want to do a quick closing, and then they'll get the financing taken care of later. Because after you've done this for 6 months as a buyer, it's much easier to get the refinance loan through the bank versus getting the original mortgage in many cases. Also, there are lower closing costs from the buyer as well. What are some risks to the buyer? Well, if the buyer does default on the contract, then they risk losing all that equity that they put into the house over the course of that contract. Which is the same as if you were to buy a house with a mortgage. If you default, then you lose all that equity and you lose your house. All of the repairs are the buyer's, repairs and maintenance are the buyer's responsibility. They're not renting the house. They're actually buying it, so it's now their responsibility. And also they're sort of limited on what they can do over the course of that contract until they've paid the seller off. So they can paint, they can do things like that, but they can't just go tearing out walls and making additions, things like that. So a lot of times where I've seen this again, where an investor maybe is trying to buy a house, or they've kind of tapped out their loan options, they want to continue to invest in homes, and so they might buy a contract with the seller. I've even seen this where it's a religious reason. A buyer, it's against their religion to take out loans to pay interest, so they might do a contract for deed with a seller with 0% interest, which is rare, but I have seen that before. So there's a lot of examples out there. Typical terms of a contract for deed is typically it's a 3-year balloon loan, essentially, where the buyer will pay sometimes 10% down on the purchase price, and at the end of 3 years they'll come up with the remainder amount of the balance, pay the seller off, and the seller's out of the picture. All of this is negotiated, and all of those terms are negotiable, but that's typically how that works. And then the interest rate charged by the seller, that really depends too. I do foresee contract for deed becoming more prevalent if the interest rates were to skyrocket. At the time of this recording, the interest rates for the home buyer are about 5%, which is still very, very good historically. But let's just say that interest rate starts to get up into the 7, 8, 9%. Well, a buyer getting a mortgage at 7, 8, 9% starts to become less appealing. Well, if the seller only has a mortgage at, say, 3%, they might be willing to sell it on contract for just 2% above or 5%. So that might become an appealing option for both the buyer and the seller. So I hope this helps to understand what a contract for deed is and what the benefits and risks are as well. Thanks.